in live, okay? All right, anybody seen it on television or Disney show? Okay, everybody's seen it. I was thrilled when I heard the musical was coming out. My son's 22 and he's named Alexander Hamilton. So I've always been a Hamilton fan. I proposed to my ex-wife Abraham Lincoln Watson. She vetoed that. I proposed Harry Truman Watson. She vetoed that. I proposed Benjamin Franklin Watson. I was going through my list, but she agreed with Alexander. So at any rate, when the musical came out, I've been amazed at the response, not only by the public, but perhaps more importantly by young folks. Does anybody have a kid or a niece or nephew that knows every single lyric? Yeah, right? It's amazing. My students do. When the musical first came out, I contacted theaters and museums around the country and said, listen, I have several lectures on Hamilton. Would you like someone to come out? Immediately, yes. And I remember the thing that turned it for me was twofold. One, I was giving a speech at Penn, at University of Pennsylvania. I walked into a big theater, 700 seats, and typically, if a professor's giving a lecture, you're lucky to get 20 senior citizens at it. Even if you offer pizza next to credit, students don't go. Every seat was full. And when I walked onto the stage, not because of me, because it was Hamilton, when I walked onto the stage, they all started rapping, how does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore, and discussion. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I remember I did that speech in the middle of a book tour, so I went back to my hotel room, and over the next 3 nights I memorized the entire musical, so that if a student started rapping, I could jump in, and at least allow them to laugh at me if I thought it was with me, right? And the second one was, I was speaking to a large high school, it's a Title I school, disadvantaged kids, and when I said Q&A, time for questions, a student raised her hand and asked me to talk about the Federalist Papers. Now, as a professor, I even tell my students, here's your qualifier. When I get to the Federalist Papers, you can just take a nap. I won't be mad, I'll wake you up when we get to the, Civil War or something. But I said, the Federalist Papers. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And a couple students raised their hand and start yelling out, Hamilton organized them. And I said, yes, why? And lots of students yell out to help New York ratify the Constitution. I'm like, when? 1788, 1789? I'm like, yes and yes. And then someone says, Hamilton wrote 51 of them. I'm like, actually it was 51. And I said, who else wrote them? They all yell, James Madison. I go, how many? 29. I'm like, yes. And then they go, John Jay wrote the last 5. Why did he only write 5? And they all yell out, because he got sick. And I said, actually, everything is accurate. Now, here's the kicker. When they did that to me, I realized there's probably 5 historians in the United States that know that. And here's a whole audience of Title I kids in an inner city who knew everything. Not because of their history teacher, not because of the textbook, but because of a Broadway musical. So at that point, I said, count me in. I was all in. And what I did was I fact-checked the entire musical from the opening line to the end. It's over 90% accurate. A lot of the lines in the musical, the lyricism, a lot of it actually comes from quotes from Hamilton, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, etc. So it's that accurate. There's some artistic license, to be sure, but it's not that bad. Much more accurate than most any movie I've ever seen. So it was spot on, and I did it as a way of pushing back against historians who were dismissing the colorblind casting. In Lin-Manuel Miranda, you had a Puerto Rican American Hamilton. His wife in the original cast was Asian. You had a black George Washington, a black Jefferson, which is interesting given his history of slavery. But I fact-checked it because I wanted to push back. I'm good to go with the colorblind casting. Anything that gets young folks excited about history, count me in, and it's accurate enough. So what I thought I'd do today is give you a little backstory on Hamilton that not a lot of people know, that I think really brings him to life. And this young, scrappy, and hungry kind of theme that runs through it, this will merit that out. Then I thought I'd take maybe 3 of the major scenes in the musical, give you the real backstory to show you how accurate it is, and then just close with, of course, the duel, and then you can ask me questions. So the story begins in the late 1600s, 1685, with something in France called the revocation of the edict, E-D-I-C-T, of Nantes, N-A-N-T-E-S. The T-E-S is silent. And what happened, there was an Edict of Nantes which allowed, under King Henry V in France, it allowed for religious freedom. This was one of the world's first measures that allowed for religious freedom in Catholic France. That would be freedom from persecution for Protestants, known as Huguenots, and for Jews. This was unheard of. Unfortunately, King Louis, the sun god, the sun king, he revoked it, and wholesale persecution reigned. You and I would recognize this type of stuff as some of the pogroms in Europe in the 1930s. They prevented interracial relationships. Certain groups of folks couldn't hold certain jobs. Consequently, there was a mass exodus from France. People left and fled around the world. One of the families that fled, the father was Jean Faucet, F-A-U-C-E-T-T-E. And they fled, and they went to a little island in the West Indies called Nevis, or Nevis. It used to be called Las Nieves, Spanish for the snows. It was named by Christopher Columbus, that wrote that he saw a gigantic snow-covered mountain. There are no gigantic snow-covered mountains in the Caribbean. He saw a cloud. But we all know Columbus was severely directionally challenged. Am I right, everybody? He arrives and says, "You are Indians." And they're like, "Who the hell is this guy," right? So Las Nieves, Nevis was kind of a place of refuge. So refugees from around the world would go there. So Jean Faucet took his family there. He marries an English woman named Mary Uppington, and they have 7 children. The island was in such a wretched condition, overrun by piracy, slavery, diseases tore through the island, hurricanes regularly hit the island. 5 of the 7 kids die in infancy, which is, that type of infant mortality rate is unimaginable for us today. The mother, Mary Uppington, I'm sure, we don't know exactly, but I'm sure, feeling the pain of all this loss and reminded of it, plus her husband was a world-class philanderer. We believe he had a lot of illegitimate children on the island. She does what women do not do. She leaves him, and she goes to the nearby island of St. Croix. So you can already see these strong women in Hamilton's life, and this notion, Hamilton, one of the few founding fathers who embraced women's equality and abolition. You know, the only other ones that are really there with him would be a Ben Franklin and perhaps a John Jay. So Hamilton is very progressive. So this Mary Uppington goes to St. Croix. She takes her youngest daughter, Rachel Faucet. Rachel's about 16. The record's not clear. That's my guess. And they go to St. Croix. Now, I'm from Boca Raton, so here's where the Boca angle comes in. Rachel's mother wants to marry her daughter into money. And she's going to use her beauty. And secondly, she lies and says Rachel's coming into a vast fortune, which wasn't true. Around that time in St. Croix, there's a Danish-German Jew named Johann Michael Levin, for Levi, right? Levin, he's Sephardic. He arrives in the island, and Rachel's mother tells him, he says, "I'm coming into a vast fortune." Rachel's mother says, "So is my daughter." And she arranges a marriage. Rachel doesn't want to marry Levin. It appears because he's about twice her age. There's the Boca angle, okay? Boca family values, I always call it. So, of course, you don't see any of that down here at the Broward. So Rachel and Levin get married. Levin spends lavishly on the wedding, buys a plantation, buys a mansion. After he gets married, he comes to find out what? Neither of them have any money. So what was very common at the time was debtor's prison. So Levin is being sent away to debtor's prison. What he does is he cuts a deal with the church and the authorities. And the church and the authorities were one and the same in history. And the deal is, you're after me for being in debt, but you're after my young wife, Rachel, for being a prostitute. Now, was she? We don't know. Did she sleep with men for money? Yes. Does that make her a prostitute? I don't know. I think it makes her a desperate woman trying to stay alive. So Levin testifies against his wife. So the courts let him go free. And Rachel goes to prison in St. Croix. If anybody's been to St. Croix, in Christianstadt, the capital city, there's a magnificent colonial fort there. In the basement of the fort, in the dungeon, is a prison, a dungeon. Rachel's about 17 when she goes to the dungeon. Now, if you replay history 10 times, I think she dies 9 of the 10. Imagine the diseases, the putrid water, the lack of health care and hygiene, the attacks from all the inmates. And Rachel's this beautiful 17-year-old girl, probably the only woman in the dungeon. She gets a break. The captain of the fort, whose name's Bertram Denully, he's a bachelor. He gets one look at Rachel and falls head over heels. So he starts to visit Rachel in her prison cell. And around this time, Rachel comes into money. We don't know how she comes into money. My theory is she's charging Captain Denully for the visits, which makes her an entrepreneur, a capitalist, right? Or someone trying to stay alive. She then tells Captain Denully, I want you to move me out of prison and move me into your home. He moves her into his home. Here's how good looking she is. He moves her mother in too. Now, she continues to make money, so I'm thinking she's still charging him. Then Rachel Fawcett Lavian announces to Captain Denully, she said, I want to be free, you're going to let me go, and I'm leaving. And he lets her go. Now, this is someone who, if she walked through the streets of St. Croix, people threw garbage on her. Remember, she was a religious refugee, a minority. She married a Jew in an even more anti-Semitic day and age, if that's possible. She was accused of being a prostitute. She slept with the prison warden, and then she's abandoning her family. She'd be a Kardashian today. So she flees St. Croix, and she goes to St. Kitts. This is her third island. She's basically going to press reboot. When she arrives in St. Kitts, a drunk Scotsman named James arrives. James's family had a castle in Scotland called the Grange, and the technical term was lesser aristocracy, not lords, but we'd say upper middle class. But James's father was sick of his young son James because James was a drunk, he gambled, couldn't hold a job. So James's father, the lord of the castle, did what dads did in history. They threw his son out of the island, out of Scotland rather. He set up an investment for James in St. Kitts. So James arrives in St. Kitts, probably drunk or hungover. He's an alcoholic. And James is on the island where Rachel is. Now, what else do we know about James? A few other things. One, in present-day parlance, we would use the word charismatic. He was unbelievably charismatic. Secondly, everybody said he's the best-looking person anybody had ever seen, which is what they said about Rachel. Rachel was called Cleopatra. She was called the Venus de Milo. So it's basically Bradgelina, right? And my students go, who? I have to say Jay-Z and Beyonce, so they understand what I'm talking about, right? So James meets Rachel. Now, they cannot get married because when Rachel fled to prison, her husband did not divorce her, and women could not legally divorce then, at that time, in the islands. So she shacks up with James. So now they become even more scandalous. They're thrown out of the island of St. Kitts. So they flee back to Nevis, where it all started, and Rachel becomes even more scandalous because she has two boys out of wedlock. The oldest, James, is named for the father and becomes a ne'er-do-well, unemployed servant, and the youngest is Alexander Hamilton. So this is his background. His mother may have been out as a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot, right, Caribbean. So this is Hamilton's background. He's not allowed to go to school. We don't know why, but it's easy to guess. One, his mother had married a Jew in an anti-Semitic day and age, and two, his mother's reputation as perhaps a practitioner of the world's oldest occupation, and that would not be agriculture. So Hamilton's there. So the mother, Rachel, decides she's going to homeschool Hamilton. And Rachel has the largest library in that three-island chain of St. Kitts, St. Croix, and Nevis. 39 books. Now that doesn't sound like much for us today, but you didn't have Amazon.com back then, right? And how are you going to get books online? How's she going to get books? But it's not that she had 39 books, it's what she got a hold of to teach Hamilton. We know because Hamilton later wrote this down. This is what she has Hamilton read. Plato's Republic, Aristotle's On Politics, John Locke's second treatise on government, which is what Jefferson plagiarized from to write the Declaration of Independence, Hobbes's Leviathan, Alexander Pope poetry, collections of Shakespeare, with the exception of the last two. The first four were like a third of my Ph.D. comprehensives. And Hamilton is reading them at 9 and 10. And he read them in Greek and Latin. Rachel knew 7 languages. As I wrote in one book, I wrote she knew how to say $2 in French, Prussian, Spanish, Portuguese. Yeah, it's good for business. Dos dólares. So she's getting this library for Hamilton. She also teaches Hamilton all these languages. So this is his upbringing. Hamilton gets a break. He's invited to go to school, finally, to a synagogue's little Hebrew school, a Hebrew school. The island has a Sephardic refugee population, which was 1/3 of the population of the island, most of whom had fled Iberia, Spain, and Portugal during the Inquisition and all the mass expulsions of Jews and others. So the Sephardic community there knew that Hamilton's mother had been married to a Sephardic Jew, Lavienne, and they knew about his persecution the way they were persecuted. So they invited him to the school. This is important for the following reason. The headmaster, it's a woman, headmistress would be the term back then. The headmistress, Hamilton always called her the Jewess. That sounds horrible today, but that's like saying sir or ma'am back then. So it was a term of great respect and reverence. She is the first person, other than Hamilton's mother, to recognize that this kid is a genius. The man is non-stop, right? That he's a genius. So she takes him under her wing and is working with him on everything. She asks him, what do you want to do when you grow up? Hamilton says, I'm going to change the course of world history. He's raised by possibly a French whore with a mentor who's a Jewish refugee on a 6-by-9-mile island. He's going to change the world. I mean, audacious. He even has a plan. He says, number one, I need a war. I knew I was poor. I wished for the war. It was the only way to what? Rise up from the musical. Hamilton did enough reading that he knew when, during a time of war is when you achieve greatness. This is a kid saying this. Number two, he said, I'm going to find the greatest man of my times, and I'm going to latch onto his coattails and ride him to fame. Hamilton would later meet who? George Washington. And Hamilton's father, drunk biological father, James Hamilton, abandons the family. Is never heard of again. He goes to Trinidad and almost dies in the slave uprising. George Washington never has a son or kids of his own, and they're the proper age apart. Washington always considered Hamilton, he called him my son, and Hamilton called Washington the father. Remember the scene in the musical, don't call me son. Son, don't call me son. One more time. So he finds Washington. The third way that Hamilton's going to rise up and change the world is, this is the Boca angle, he's going to marry a wealthy older woman. Okay? So he's going to marry into money. So the old-fashioned way of making money, a wife-made man. And he says, I watched my mother. She could get any man to do anything she wants. Hamilton could be arrogant. He knew he was so handsome, he said, I can get any woman to do what I want. He also wrote poetry as a kid. He said, they love my poems. He grew up reading Shakespeare and Alexander Pope. Not bad training if you want to be a wordsmith. And I think it's marvelous that a lyrically brilliant musical today celebrates a kid who was growing up as a poet. I think it's also great that Lin-Manuel Miranda took this musical to Puerto Rico to raise money for hurricane relief, because a hurricane wipes the island out. Hamilton writes about it, and they use Hamilton's poem to raise money for hurricane relief back in the 1700s. So some nice historical parallels there. So that's Hamilton's plan. So unfortunately for Hamilton, the mother gets a summons. She must go back to St. Croix, because Lavienne shows up and now he wants a divorce. So she has to go back. Can you imagine Rachel's feeling of going back to St. Croix, where she was imprisoned for being a prostitute, where people threw trash on her? Whatever her two boys did not know about her past was about to be news at 11, right? So she leaves and goes back by herself. She's a single mom now, to St. Croix. What happens when they're in St. Croix is she takes up a new job. She becomes a chandler. A chandlery is a warehouser for ships. So she provided all the ships that came to the island with tar, sails, tropical fruit, water, whatever they needed. And she makes a decent amount of money. Remember, she already knew all the shipping captains, because that's what she did business with in her other occupation. So she makes money. Hamilton becomes her business partner and office manager at 10. Shipping captains use Hamilton's services because he speaks so many languages, and he's a mathematical, financial protege, genius. So they have him come on board the ships and redo the ship's logs, manifests, and journals. Remember, these ships that came to the island, this is the 18th century equivalent of a Fortune 500 multinational. And they're getting a 10-year-old kid to redo the books. So Hamilton and his mom have a house, a roof over their head, they're making money, but then a yellow fever epidemic strikes the island, brought by a mosquito, Aedes aegypti, the unwelcome Egyptian, and it wipes out 50% of the island. Hamilton contracts the disease, his mother does, and the mother dies. Hamilton's now an orphan.
Production everything.
They would not, the church would not let her have services because of her reputation in marrying a Jew. She could not be buried there. So Hamilton and his brother carry her up on a hill and bury her under a tree with a commanding view of the ocean. Hamilton presides over the service. Now the boys are homeless, shoeless, starving orphans. Hamilton was dumpster diving for food. If you replay this 10 times in history, young, scrappy, hungry. Where I grew up, they don't get twice as many. He knew he wasn't going to live past 20. Remember the lyrics in the musical? Hamilton would have died. But there's charity from two sources, the Jewish community and a shipping company called Kruger and Beekman, Kruger with a C. Kruger admired Hamilton and his mother's work, so he hires Hamilton. It's Kruger and Beekman, an international Dutch shipping company. At 12, they hire Hamilton to be their office manager. At 14, they go back to the New Jersey headquarters and put Hamilton in charge of the West Indies shipping operation. This is unimaginable, right? So Hamilton's doing very well, but then a hurricane hits the island. And then a hurricane came, devastation reigned, our man saw his future dripping down the drain. So a hurricane wipes out the island, destroys the home, destroys the shipping company. Hamilton's again homeless. This is when they take up a collection with sending to the mainland, right? Go get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world's gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Right. So they take up a collection, Kruger, the shippers, the Jewish community and people that liked Hamilton, and they send him to America. We don't know the details. I guess it's on one of the ships who's the captain still missed his mother. Hamilton arrives in 1773 at the time of the Boston Tea Party. So he's knee-deep in revolution, and he immediately latches onto it. Hamilton is bookish, so he wants to finally get a real education. He had a few years at a Hebrew school in Nevis, as I said. So Hamilton hears that there's a college in New Jersey that's today called Princeton. And somebody tells him about it. That somebody would be Aaron Burr, Hamilton's frenemy, friend turned enemy. So Hamilton says, I'm going to go to Princeton. So he goes to Princeton and demands, typical Hamilton, audacious, demands to meet with the president of Princeton. You know, an orphan teenage kid from a 6x9 mile rock. That's not how you go in and get into Princeton, right? He starts walking in to meet the president. He gets into a fight and he punches out one of the university administrators, so they throw him out of the school. Hamilton leaves and goes to the greatest city in the world. Not Fort Lauderdale, New York City. New York City. And in New York City, he meets a lifelong friend named Hercules Mulligan, who's another immigrant like Hamilton. He's Irish. In the musical, he's the big guy that does the gangster rap, Hercules Mulligan. I'm running with the Sons of Liberty and I'm loving it, right? Hercules Mulligan was in the Sons of Liberty. He turns Hamilton on to revolutionary politics. Hamilton stays at his house because he has nowhere to go. And Hercules tells him there's a good school in New York City called King's College. Today it's known as Columbia. So Hamilton says, well, I'm going to Columbia, the King's College. So he goes there and he demands to meet with the president of the college. Unlearned. Dr. Miles Cooper. He barges down the hallway and busts into Miles Cooper's office and tells him, I'm going to King's College. Cooper is so blown away with Hamilton, this kid, this teenager. He's the smartest one he's ever met. His charisma, his audacity, he's the most handsome person he's ever met. Remember, his parents were Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, right? Or Beyonce and Jay-Z, right? So Cooper says yes. He lets Hamilton go free of charge. I'm paying 2 expensive private school tuitions right now on a professor's salary. So if you wondered why Kelly said I wrote so many books, it's to live. not because I have anything to say. So Hamilton goes to school for free. What does he do at King's College? What doesn't he do? As soon as he's at King's College, there's a rowdy mob of so-called patriots who attack King's College, like the January 6th idiots. And they attack King's College. They want to kill or tar and feather President Cooper. Even though Cooper is a loyalist, a royalist. He's pro-crown. If you're the president of King's College, you have to be pro-king. Hamilton's a patriot, but he risks his life, holds off the mob, and helps President Cooper to escape. When my son went to college, I told him the story and said, that was what Hamilton did as a freshman. No pressure. What else does he do? There's an orator named the Most Reverend Samuel Seabury. Remember him in the musical? Hear ye, I am Samuel Seabury. Samuel Seabury was a famous orator, pamphleteer, rhetorician. He would get up and speak for hours and criticize us for wanting to leave the king. So here's what we know from Seabury, Hamilton, newspapers, and several other people all wrote about it. One day, Seabury is standing up under a tree with lanterns, giving a grand oration criticizing the Patriots. And a teenage kid challenges him to a debate. Hamilton smokes Seabury. So much so that Seabury will never debate him again, will never speak to him. What Seabury does is he writes what's called broadsides. This is like a one-page newspaper/poster, and he tacks them on the pub doors, telling people that we should stay with the king. Wherever Seabury does that, Hamilton writes a rebuttal and tacks it over. Hamilton becomes famous in New York for this. And the third thing he does as a student, remember he wished for a war. I knew I was poor. I knew it was the only way to what? Rise up, right? So that happens in summer of 1776. The British under General Howe, and the numbers in the musical are right, 32,000 men in New York Harbor. There was, and then they also brought 9,000 Hessian mercenaries with them. These are the Germanic soldiers of fortune, the biggest, most feared warriors on earth, under Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl. They called him the Hessian Lion. He was like a real-life Dracula type of figure and what he would do to people. So this is what comes to meet George. They land in New York City. George is in Brooklyn. He has maybe 10,000 men. They build earthworks, trenches, they dig in. His army is routed immediately. They end up crossing the river and running for their lives. Literally, they're running for their lives. They're leaving behind artillery, wagons, the wounded. They have no choice. They run all the way up Manhattan. They didn't have time to catch the musical, couldn't get tickets. They race all the way up to White Plains. And at White Plains, Howe hits him and Washington manages to hold the British off. Washington realizes if I keep racing north, Howe will follow me all the way to Canada, and he's losing men by the hour. I need to do something. Washington was very tricky. What he does is he turns around and goes south, the last thing Howe would think of. He goes all the way across New Jersey. Thank goodness Governor Christie wasn't in office because the bridges were open, right? Including the George Washington Bridge. He races all the way across New Jersey, crosses the Delaware River, which separates New Jersey from Pennsylvania, and camps on the Pennsylvania side. It's almost Christmas. You all know about the crossing of the Delaware, right? So Washington's army goes from 10,000 to 2,400, half of whom are either too sick, don't have shoes, or don't have a musket. They can't fight. He has barely over 1,000 men that can fight. The war is ending. Washington knows there's a problem. On New Year's Eve, the enlistments of his army are up. They're all just going to walk home. And that's the end. The revolution ends with a whimper. Hamilton hears the fighting. He hooks out of class. He leaves King's College. He gets Hercules Mulligan, and they run down to the Battery. Everybody, the Battery in Lower Manhattan. And there, an armada of British warships is coming ashore. And Hamilton runs and kills one of the British setting up an artillery and turns the cannon around, figures out how to fire it, and these teenage kids are firing a cannon at a flotilla of warships as far as the eye can see. His suicidal bravery was a hallmark of Hamilton's. Finally, they realize they can't do this and live. So the men, Hercules, Hamilton, they run. Hamilton realizes they forgot some of their muskets back, so he runs back as the British are landing under fire and goes running away, and he doesn't get hit. I don't know how. Now what Hamilton does is he wants to unite with George Washington, so he follows Washington's army all the way across New Jersey. How did he follow them? Because any man that was a straggler, the Hessian lion would catch, torture them in medieval ways, and then bayonet them to a tree and leave them hanging from a tree as his calling card. Hamilton followed corpses and mutilated, tortured dead men all the way across New Jersey, stealing a horse. Now, anybody else would have turned back because of the horror, but Hamilton was that brave. He crosses the Delaware and reunites with Washington's army. Washington knows he needs to do something big, so on Christmas night, 76, he says we're going to cross the Delaware and attack Raw and the Hessians. You know, if you're a coach at FAU in football, and you're 0-10, and you beat Nova, you're not going to keep your job. If you beat Clemson, you're going to keep your job, right? So Washington knew he had to take on Howe, the most feared warrior of the day. He doesn't tell his soldiers, because if he did, they all would have run away. So Washington sneaks across the Delaware River, and as the Hessians are waking up in the morning, drunk from Christmas, hungover, bloated, Washington says we're going to attack them. What I need, though, is someone to put artillery up front and blow the doors down. Now, because of the rain and crossing the river, the powder might be wet. The cannon might not go. So this will be a suicide effort. Who would volunteer for that? Young man, Hamilton. Okay, Hamilton, you have the suicide mission. Hamilton becomes the hero of the Battle of Trenton. And they annihilate the Hessians, they kill Raw, and then steal all the Hessian goods. Washington saves the war. Washington decides on January 3rd, 1777, he's going to press his luck again. Now he's going to hit Howe and the entire British Army at Princeton, New Jersey. You can't attack a larger army. So Washington's going to try to sneak around and outflank. He says, I need somebody to lead a fake suicide attack up the front. Hamilton. Okay, Hamilton. Hamilton's the hero of the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton. Amazing. After this battle, something important happens for Hamilton's life. Washington's two, in my opinion, best generals, Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene, they approach Washington, and I'm so glad this is in the musical. And they say to Washington, have you heard of this kid? Hamilton. Non-stop. The kid's insane, man. That's what they say in the musical. We'd like to make him an officer. Now, the only way you were an officer in history, your father had to be a blue blood and an officer, and his father before him, and his father, Hamilton. So they were making an outrageous request of Washington. And Washington says, no, he's my aide. Washington makes Hamilton a colonel and his chief aide-de-camp. What does Hamilton do? He handles all Washington's translation. Remember, he speaks everything. Hamilton writes Washington's speeches. Hamilton is Washington's liaison to the Continental Congress. Hamilton works with the quartermaster to keep the army fed and clothed. Hamilton's winning the war, this kid. The great Prussian general Baron von Steuben comes over in the winter to train Washington's untrained army. There's only one problem. Von Steuben doesn't speak a word of English, and Washington doesn't speak Prussian. Does anybody in this army speak Prussian? Hamilton. So Hamilton's the liaison. The Marquis de Lafayette comes over, bringing Admiral de Grasse, General Rochambeau. Has anybody parlez-vous? Hamilton. Hamilton, 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 Hamilton. As a kid. So that's his background. Just real quickly, some 3 scenes from the movie, a musical, and I'll end it. In the musical, Hamilton has 3 friends, and the 4 of them are always goofing around, right? The 4 of them, and they drink and they talk about ladies. In real life, they drank and they were non-stop with the ladies. One was Hercules Mulligan, who was an Irish immigrant and a tailor in New York City. The second one was the Marquis de Lafayette, who was 18 when he was in command of an army. A French immigrant, like Hamilton. All 3 are immigrants. And the 4th one was John Lawrence, who was the only one who wasn't an immigrant. His father was a founding father, by the way, Henry. John Lawrence is a wealthy family, plantation, slave-owning family in South Carolina. He would become Hamilton's best friend. Why? Lawrence abhors slavery. Lawrence's father basically throws him out. He gives him some slaves and says, get out. Lawrence and Hamilton free the slaves and create the first black battalion. They both believe in women's equality. They both are against slavery. They're the same age. They're absolute suicidal beasts on the battlefield and non-stop with the ladies. young women around the country wrote letters. I found some of them about Hamilton and Lawrence. They were like, I don't know, it was like Brad Pitt and Denzel, I don't know, right? And later you can ask me about the letters. Some of them are quite interesting and R-rated plus. At any rate, those are the four guys. Now, Washington called those four boys, quote unquote, my military family. Those were his sons. And all four of them helped to win the war. So I'm glad that they're in the musical and they were real. The main battle of the war, which is one of my favorite scenes in the musical, is the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. Right? It's September and October 1781. Washington has a lot of defeats, a handful of wins. He needs one big victory to end this thing. He needs a big W. And he gets it at Yorktown, which is on the coast of Tidewater in Virginia. And it's against Lord Sir Cornwallis and a massive British army. Cornwallis is kicked out of South Carolina, races all the way to Virginia. The plan is he contacts the British Navy, which is still in New York City. They're going to sail down and help him to escape. So Washington hears about this. How does he hear about it? Number one, it's John Lawrence, Hamilton's friend, who kicks Cornwallis out of South Carolina. So it's the four boys that win this battle. Number two, Hercules Mulligan spies on the British Army and steals the plans to sail down and evacuate them. So now Washington knows what's happening. The British try to sneak out of Yorktown at night. It's Marquis de Lafayette catches them and boxes them in and puts them back into the trap. And Washington says it's now time to attack, defeat Cornwallis and end the war. I need somebody to lead the attack. Hamilton. But what it is they have 8 large artillery batteries outside of their camp. As you try to build a trench or sneak up, the British can fire down with canisters of grape shot. That's like a giant shotgun. It's suicide. So Washington says, I need you, take your bullets out your gun, take your bullets out your gun. We move undercover and we move as one, right? The lines in the musical. So no firing of shots, because the British hear the shot, they know we're coming. I need someone to sneak over the artillery battery, kill them with your bare hands, turn the cannons around, and when the British wake up, that's what they wake up to. And Hamilton did it, the hero again of Yorktown. So the last thing I wanted to say was the room where it happened. So that's one of the great scenes in the musical. What it is we spent from 1775, when the revolution began, until actually November 1, 1800, we spent fighting over where the capital city should be. And we couldn't agree. We didn't know how to pay the debt. Everything we agreed on, Jefferson and the Southerners said, we're going to leave the Union if we have to pay taxes. We're going to leave the Union if we can't have slavery. We're going to leave the Union if we have to pay back the debt. They didn't even want to go to Philadelphia, because Philadelphia had a rule. If you were there with a slave, the slave became free. So what Southerners did is they'd alternate their slaves like every 2 weeks so they could get around the rule. So we were in complete gridlock. It was June 20th, 1790 in New York City. Jefferson invites Hamilton to a dinner party. I plan the menu, the venue, the seating, right? With James Madison. And the two of them are going to dupe Hamilton into getting everything they want. The whole country is in a gridlock. So the three of them, Jefferson and Madison, 2 Virginians, against Hamilton, meet for dinner and decide the whole future of this government over one dinner party. I always used to call it, I wrote about this 25, 30 years ago, I used to call it the most famous dinner party in history. But I was giving a speech in Phoenix, and as soon as I started, a lady stood up and started screaming at me. I'm like, ma'am, what is wrong? I'm just starting. She goes, that is not the most famous dinner party in history. I'm like, okay, what is? She said, the Last Supper. Whoops. So now I call it the second most famous dinner party. Anyway, over dinner, they solved everything. Now here's the kicker. Jefferson said, Madison and I are brilliant. We'll get everything we want from Hamilton. Little did they know Hamilton was brilliant and street smart. Jefferson and Madison could be academically bookish, naive. Short story, Hamilton gets everything he wants. Jefferson writes a letter to Washington saying, this is the worst moment of my life, when he realized Hamilton talked him into everything. So that's the room where it happened. Hamilton dies in a duel, July 11th, 1804, with Aaron Burr. Dueling was actually rather common at the time. There was even an official congressional dueling ground, which we should think about bringing back. Why did they duel in New York City? That's where they both lived, because New York City had made dueling illegal. That's why they went to New Jersey, because what? Everything's legal in Jersey, right? Dawn, guns drawn. If this gentleman and I are going to welcome Ed, welcome to the job. If Ed and I are going to have a duel, 48 hours now, right? And by the way, every day, that's just what they do. Kelly says hello to you, and we have speakers. So you don't actually right. If Ed and I are going to duel, we don't just throw down in the streets. There's a way to do it. I say, sir, I demand satisfaction. And then Ed would say, well, then I'll see you on the field of honor. And I would say, dawn. And he would say, guns drawn. And there were 10 rules that we had to follow. And Hamilton turns it into the 10 dual commandments and follows, not to a T, but. So Hamilton and Burr gather at dawn to duel. And Hamilton let Burr know through his second that he will not shoot Burr. Most men would meet, and what we would do is we both miss on purpose. So we have our honor, but we're both alive, right? So Hamilton says, I won't shoot. Burr apparently doesn't get the memo. I think Burr never writes about this. I think what happened is they're across from one another. Burr wanted to be Washington's aide during the war. Washington picked Hamilton. Burr wanted to be the hero of the Revolution. Hamilton was the hero. Burr wanted to be the founding father who's an architect of the nation. That was Hamilton. Burr moves to New York City and is the most high-priced lawyer in the city until Hamilton moves to New York City and opens up a law firm next door. And all the clients go to Hamilton. Burr considers himself the top ladies' man in New York City, boasting narcissistically that I could bet any woman, until Alexander Clooney moves in next door. And all the women, Burr is livid because all the ladies like Hamilton. So I think Burr is looking across at Hamilton and everything he wanted in life. This guy who's better looking, smarter, more talented, stronger, took from him. And I think Burr lost his you-know-what, shot him. Bullet cuts through 3 organs, lodges in the spine. Hamilton is paralyzed before he hits the ground. He goes unconscious. Some sloppy historian said he fired. As he's falling backward, he involuntarily squeezes one off and hits a tree. He's rowed across the river and dies the next day. He's the founder that doesn't live to see 50. Doesn't live to see 50. And he's basically forgotten. With 2 exceptions, the $10 bill and Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote a musical. We know a lot about Hamilton because his wife Eliza lives to be 97 in a day and age where people are lucky to make 35. And Eliza and the youngest son, Philip, with one L named for the oldest boy, Philip, who died, they collect all Hamilton's papers, and we know probably more about Hamilton than any other founder, with the exception of his youth. Everything we know about his youth, I pretty much told you in the first 15 minutes of this. And this musical has rejuvenated this remarkable founder, who without him, this country would be unrecognizably different. So, thank you.
Pretty impressive. We had a 3 o'clock ending time.
Whoa, it's 3 o'clock.
You're pretty good at that.
Yeah,
listen, thank you so much for that. I'm going to see if anybody here has a burning question before we get out of here. And I was going to get the question started, and you ended my answer. How do we know so much about this guy?
2 things. Eliza put together all of his papers, and as they wrap in the musical, Hamilton wrote like he was running out of time. Hamilton, I wrote my way up, I wrote my way out. Hamilton knew he had the skill with the quill. Hamilton was a great writer, and his whole life he was a great debater and a great writer, and that got him what he wanted. Hamilton is a lot like Ulysses Grant and Harry Truman. All historians agree that those are the 2 best presidential memoirs because these guys were good writers like Hamilton, and they were honest to a fault. Hamilton was incapable of fibbing or telling a lie. How refreshing. He was that honest, and it even got himself into a lot of trouble. So what we love about it is he wrote everything down, saved everything like a pack rat. Eliza burned some of the love letters with Mariah Reynolds, but other than that, and he was so honest that historians are in agreement when you read Hamilton, when you read Truman, when you read Grant, if they say they saw an alien, they saw an alien. That's how honest they were. So that's why we know so much about it.
Excellent. Any other questions?
Sure.
Go, Arthur.
Hamilton, some historians believe he was a slave owner as well.
Can
Was
you repeat that?
Was Hamilton a slave owner? Some sloppy historians have been arguing that he was a slave owner. When Hamilton was a kid, about 12 to 14, he worked at that trading charter, right? And that was owned by Kruger and Beekman. They traded tropical birds, rum, molasses, sugar, also slaves. So Hamilton was a homeless dying kid who was their office manager, yes. As an adult, did Hamilton own slaves and trade slaves? No, he was an abolitionist. Hamilton and John Jay co-founded the very first abolitionist society in the United States, the New York Society for Manumission. So, do we blame Hamilton when he's 13 and starving and working for someone? I think we can excuse him of that, given George Washington owned slaves.
His father-in-law was a slave?
Jefferson. Philip Schuyler had some slaves. Philip Schuyler, a senator from New York, had some slaves. Eliza, Hamilton's wife, would come around to supporting her husband's views on abolition. So Hamilton was considered, in fact, Hamilton, A, because he's from the West Indies, B, he was sexually very loose and active, and C, because of his hardcore abolition. A lot of the founders, including John Adams, used to say Hamilton was black. That's why. So he was seen as so aggressively supportive of ending slavery that he was said to be black. Hamilton, as a kid, his mother had one slave, a young boy. She taught the boy to read and write, which was illegal and freebie, and he and Hamilton were playmates. So his word gets back that Hamilton played with. This is a day and age when enslaved individuals were viewed as property. We need to put ourselves in that mindset. So even the fact that he advocated abolition makes him off the charts, but the fact that he owned the New York Society, he founded the New York Society for Manumission. Yes, so that's not entirely, it's one of those questions, yes, but, so yeah, I push back on that, yeah. And I don't have rose-colored glasses. I think there was one more.
One more question?
On the love story angle, the Schuyler sisters, was there any truth to the love triangle between the sisters and...
Ooh, the love triangle. A good way to end this with Hamilton and Angelica, right? So there were several Schuyler sisters. The musical has just three. Angelica, Eliza, Elizabeth, and Peggy. Her name was Marguerite. That was her nickname. Peggy was the youngest. That's why she always goes, and Peggy. She was just a kid. So Hamilton wants to marry up. Remember, one of his three ways of... Yeah. So enter the Schuyler sisters. General Philip Schuyler was wealthy. By the way, if you're in Albany, the Schuyler mansion where Hamilton courted Eliza is still there. Second floor. That's the other room where it happened, right? At any rate, Hamilton says, I want to marry a Schuyler sister, and which one doesn't matter. So there's that side of Hamilton. I always say with Hamilton, it's easy to love Hamilton and hard to like him, because he could be so opinionated. So at any rate, so the problem is Hamilton's so indispensable to Washington won't let Hamilton go to Albany. So finally Washington agrees, and Hamilton courts the middle daughter, Eliza. There's multiple daughters. Angelica liked Hamilton. Now what the musical doesn't tell you is Angelica was already married to a British guy named Church, who was older than her, a smaller, round fellow, who was never home. Hamilton marries... Say again?
She had 3 kids as well?
She had multiple kids. Hamilton had 8 with Eliza. The oldest one is killed in a duel. The second oldest, the daughter, has a mental breakdown after that. The other 6 live, have kids. There's still descendants running around. So what happens is he marries Eliza. And they have a good marriage. Does he have affairs? Yes. Am I condoning it? Absolutely not. Do I understand such things? I'm divorced. I don't understand how this stuff works, but they had a good marriage. My guess is Hamilton 1 was just off the charts, charismatic and fascinating. Number 2, Eliza was impressive. And Hamilton respected her intellect and thought women were equal. Where is she going to find him? How are you going to find a man today, right? Where are you going to find a man then who has that view of women? Give you some sense of how impressive Angelica and Eliza was. I'm a big Ben Franklin fan. Oh, by the way, I wore my Hamilton socks for you all today. I'm running out the door. I'm like, no, wait. Kelly will like the socks. So, at any rate, Ben Franklin, it was not seen as proper to teach women to play chess. Number one, they would not be attractive. Two, they were not smart enough to play chess. Ben Franklin met the Schuyler sisters and taught them all how to play chess. So if you're good enough for Ben Franklin, it was America's Leonardo, right? So they had a good marriage, so I think despite all that, there's some letters left to Angelica from Hamilton and to Hamilton from Angelica, and between Angelica and a woman named Maria Causeway, who was an Italian artist. And they both had the hots for Hamilton. Did Angelica and Hamilton consummate that? I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they did, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did. If you held a gun to my head, I would say no, just because Angelica loved her sister so much. In fact, there's a letter in the musical that I'm glad that they put it in there. Hamilton wrote Angelica. Now, some people say, oh, they definitely had an affair because the language. I am your obedient servant with all my love, my dearest. But that's how people talked. Abraham Lincoln wrote to his male friends that way as late as the 1850s, right? So this is the way people talked. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote like that in the early 1900s. At any rate, in one of his letters to Angelica, he would write, my dearest Angelica, comma. But in one letter he writes, my dearest, comma, Angelica. The placement of that comma changes the meaning of the letter. And Angelica just melts down. What does he mean by my dear? And is this, does it, and she's just all, like she's going to the prom or something, right? So they definitely enjoyed one another's company. There was definitely some romantic sparks. Beyond that, we don't know. But the musical has Angelica introducing Eliza to Hamilton and always wanting to marry him, and when in fact she was already married. So, congratulations on all the amazing things you all do. To Kelly, Jan, and your team, you have great leadership here. I quite consider it a pleasure and an honor to be able to work with them. And do a good job with this wonderful musical and everything else. Thanks.